Your paper should be taped down on all four sides to some sort of a hard surface, like an artboard. So there my paper is taped down on all four sides. You need watercolor paints, of course, water. I'm only using one brush here, but you could have several brushes if you want. Sometimes bristles are arranged in a flat formation, and sometimes they're arranged in a round formation. So round brushes and flat brushes are both common for watercolor. You need some paper towel, tissue paper, Kleenex, anything like that. If you have a paint kit like this one, you can use the lid as a palette for mixing paint, for customizing a color to achieve a particular hue. Remember that when you're painting with watercolor, light should be able to shine through the pigment, hit the white of the paper, and bounce back out and travel to the viewer's eye. So in other words, watercolor pigment should never be super opaque. So don't put it down too thick. Don't oversaturate the paper and try to build up layers and layers of thick paint. That is just not the nature of watercolor. I encourage you to put down a color, and then before it's dry, add another color into it to achieve visual complexity and variety in your hues, in your colors. So now I'm just adding some violet to my blue and just letting it mix. Wet in wet, we call that. You'll notice that if you wet the paper first and then paint with watercolor, you'll have some minor bleeding outside the wet part of the paper. Sometimes you might want that for a particular visual effect, but sometimes you might not. If you've lightly drawn in a shape that you want to paint, then just be aware of how wet the paper is around the perimeter of your shape. So in this case, my paper is completely dry, and maybe I would just wet the inside of the shape carefully first and then start painting. But I want to be really careful to paint inside my pencil line so I can preserve the particular shape that I've drawn. And sometimes that might mean carefully painting subtle changes in contour so that I can preserve the beautiful contours that I've created. So there's a shape that I've painted in, and I used a mixture of blue and green to achieve some nice visual complexity. And before the paint dries, I might even add a little splotch of orange just to a part of my shape. But you have to be careful not to overpaint. So when you do add one color into another, do so quickly and then move on, and try not to overpaint. Let me show you a little trick. Sometimes you might lay down a color and realize that you've put it on too thick and that the value of the color is too dark. So you can do this. Have your water nearby, wash out your brush, dry it so that it's damp, and then quickly paint over the splotch that you've just painted. And it's like you're sopping up. See, I'm sopping up the paint. But what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the water that's on the paper, the wash, with my brush, and then drying my brush in the towel. So that's a nice way to control the value of your paint applications. So I've lightened up this section just by wetting and sopping it up with a wet brush, semi-wet brush. So that's why a paper towel is a great tool for artists when they are painting with watercolor. So to create light values in watercolor, maybe I'll use this palette and make myself a really dilute wash. So I want to use more water, less pigment. To make a darker value now, I want to use a little bit more pigment so that value is a little bit darker. Here's my first fairly light value. Here's my middle value. What color darkens all other colors? Black. So what I can do here is get some black and mix it into my violet in my palette here in order to achieve, there we go, a darker violet. So I have 3 different values of violet there, light, middle, and dark. And then of course I could go even darker by adding more black. When I started this quick tutorial, I painted this piece of color here, and I've been purposely just leaving it alone, letting it dry, which it is now. I just wanted to show you that not only can you blend colors wet in wet, but you can go back to previously painted parts of your painting and layer another color over top once it's dry, as long as you do it carefully, because watercolor pigment is not permanent. If you wet it once it's on the paper, it will reactivate. So right now my brush is wet, it has pigment in it, so I'm going to just carefully paint a thin layer of orange over top of that blue. But I don't want to work it too much because I'll reactivate the blue that's underneath, and I don't necessarily want to do that. I just want the orange laying on top of the already dried blue. So I could do the same here. I think this piece of orange is fairly dry, so maybe now I go in with some yellow and I just add that on top. So try that too. Try layering colors. Watercolor artists almost never use just one single color in any given area of their painting, unless maybe they're painting in an ultra light value. But typically they want to layer colors or blend colors like I did here. Blend colors like I did there, wet in wet, and that's to achieve visual complexity and a degree of maturity in their artwork. Have fun with the watercolor.